October 1962. The Kremlin. In a windowless chamber deep within Moscow's fortress, Nikita Khrushchev signs an order that will push humanity toward nuclear annihilation. He believes his gamble is foolproof. He is certain the missiles will arrive undetected. He is convinced the Americans will never find out. But in a locked room 7,000 miles away, CIA analysts are already studying the photographs. By 1962, Nikita Khrushchev faced a humiliation that consumed him. America's military superiority was absolute. The Strategic Air Command operated from 127 bases worldwide, employing 230,000 personnel. Every day, 60 to 70 B-47 stratojets circled the Soviet Union, each carrying 4 1-megaton bombs, 260 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The Soviets had 4 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 4 against thousands. Khrushchev, who had survived Stalin's purges through cunning and compromise, now faced challenges from within. Military hardliners questioned his resolve. They whispered he had gone soft, that the revolutionary fire had died. In September 1962, he approved Operation Anadr. The plan was audacious. Soviet ships would secretly transport nuclear missiles to Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. Fidel Castro had ruled the island for only 3 years, and his grip remained tenuous. The CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion had failed just 8 months earlier, but American-sponsored exile forces still threatened. If Cuba fell, the Soviets would lose their only strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The missiles would change everything. Soviet planners calculated that by the time American reconnaissance detected deployment, reversal would be impossible without triggering war. By early November, the missiles would be armed and operational. General Sergei Shidov briefed Khrushchev on the Art-12 specifications: 23 meters long, 45 tons each, range of 2,400 kilometers. They could strike Washington with 4-megaton warheads. Khrushchev asked the critical question, how long until the Americans discover us? Shidov's answer came with confidence. By the time photographic evidence emerged, positioning would be too advanced to reverse. Kennedy would face an impossible calculation: risk American cities for an island 90 miles away. Surely Kennedy was rational enough to accept this new reality. What Soviet intelligence didn't know: American reconnaissance had already detected anomalous activity across Cuba. The UTWO program represented American technological supremacy. The aircraft itself remained so classified that fewer than 200 pilots knew it existed. Equipped with cameras that could distinguish a 2-meter object from 21 kilometers up, a single UTWO could photograph 100 by 1,200 kilometers in one pass. Khrushchev assumed such flights would be rare. Intelligence suggested Kennedy had scaled back UTWO operations after Gary Powers was shot down in 1960. Perhaps the Americans would show similar caution over Cuba. They were catastrophically wrong. By October 8th, American intelligence had confirmed Soviet missile construction sites on Cuban soil. Not rumors, physical confirmation. The Americans had photographs. Kennedy had already been briefed. What Soviet leadership couldn't fathom: Kennedy had been given a choice between keeping the intelligence secret or going public. He chose to wait until he could speak from maximum advantage. Khrushchev had built his entire strategy on a fundamental miscalculation. He believed Americans would behave like Soviets, hiding weakness until overwhelming force could be assembled. He believed Kennedy, facing midterm elections, would feel too politically vulnerable to act. Over the next 13 days, every one of his assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. Monday, October 22, 1962, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. President Kennedy addressed 90 million Americans in a televised broadcast. His voice was steady, his demeanor grave but controlled. He informed the nation that the Soviet Union had secretly introduced offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba, missiles capable of striking throughout the continental United States and Caribbean. American naval forces would quarantine the island, preventing further Soviet weapons from reaching Cuban soil. Any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as a Soviet attack on the United States, triggering full retaliation against the Soviet Union itself. The president was announcing a naval blockade, an act of war in all but name. In Moscow, Khrushchev learned of the address through official channels. His political position was crumbling. He had gambled on American weakness. He had miscalculated Kennedy's willingness to risk everything. What he didn't yet understand, the true scale of what American intelligence had discovered. Khrushchev believed the Americans had found perhaps a dozen missiles. In fact, American intelligence had counted 42 warheads deployed at 4 separate locations. 3 surface-to-air missile sites with 144 S-ATWO missiles surrounded the installations, each capable of striking reconnaissance aircraft at 15 kilometers. Kennedy had already authorized contingency plans for airstrikes. The Joint Chiefs recommended a surprise assault beginning October 27. Air Force planners calculated 168 tactical aircraft could destroy 90% of known installations in a single wave. What the Joint Chiefs didn't know, their 90% estimate was fatally flawed. Soviet planners, anticipating invasion, had distributed operational control of tactical nuclear weapons to field commanders. At least 4 battlefield nukes with yields of 5 to 15 kilotons, enough to kill between 200,000 and 1 million American soldiers in a single blast. Soviet field commanders had authorization to employ these weapons without awaiting Moscow's permission. What Pentagon planners envisioned as a surgical strike could have become the opening engagement of thermonuclear war. Kennedy, unaware of the tactical weapons, continued developing military options. 156 tactical fighters repositioned to Florida and Georgia. 21 strategic bombers carrying nuclear weapons launched into continuous airborne alert. Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2, the highest peacetime readiness in American history. For the first time in the Cold War, American strategic forces operated on launch-on warning status. American ICBMs now had orders to launch in response to incoming Soviet missiles without awaiting confirmation. The system was automated. If Soviet radars detected an attack, if those signals reached command centers, if those centers calculated a launch was underway, American missiles would fire. The apparatus was designed to retaliate before Soviet missiles could reach American soil. 139 bombers, each carrying 9 megaton warheads, circled designated Soviet targets at any given moment. In Moscow, General Matvey Zakharov outlined a devastating counterstrike. If American aircraft attacked Cuba, the Soviets would respond. Nay, oases throughout Europe would come under attack. American forces in West Berlin would face encirclement. Soviet planners calculated Berlin would fall within 72 hours. A Soviet response to American action in Cuba wouldn't remain Cuban. It would trigger cascading escalations across every Cold War theater simultaneously. Khrushchev's choice: accept humiliation or risk total war. What he didn't know, Kennedy was aware of this exact calculus and had decided to take the risk anyway. By October 24th, American naval forces had established the quarantine 430 kilometers from Cuba. Destroyers and cruisers formed a perimeter. Sonar operators tracked Soviet submarine activity. At least one Foxtrot-class submarine, B-59, operated in Cuban waters carrying acoustic torpedoes fitted with nuclear warheads. Captain Valentin Savitsky had orders to defend Soviet vessels against American attack. He hadn't received clear information about the state of relations. He didn't know if war had begun or if negotiations were underway. His last radio communications from Moscow had been garbled. When American destroyers began deploying depth charges as warning signals, Savitsky believed he was under attack. He believed war had commenced. He calculated his submarine represented the Soviet Union's best chance to strike back. Savitsky requested authorization to launch his nuclear-armed torpedo at the nearby American carrier group. His deputy commander, Vasily Arkhipov, intervened. Arkhipov argued against launch, insisting the situation remained unclear. Arkhipov's intervention prevented the launch. What the American Navy didn't know: their warning signals were being interpreted as the opening shots of war. What American commanders didn't know: they were separated from thermonuclear conflict by the judgment of a single Soviet officer. One man, Vasily Arkhipov. His decision. By Thursday, October 25th, tension had reached unbearable levels. American reconnaissance pilots continued flying over Cuba, photographing missile sites. Soviet air defense tracked each aircraft. The pilots knew they were flying into Soviet fire. They flew anyway. One pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was flying his Utwo over central Cuba at 2,100 meters. His aircraft was unarmed, cameras and nothing else. Soviet air defense commanders operating under standing orders made their decision. They launched a surface-to-air missile. The missile struck Anderson's aircraft at 10:28 a.m. Cuban time. He ejected. As his parachute descended, Cuban militiamen opened fire with small arms. Major Rudolf Anderson, 34 years old, from South Carolina, became the only American killed by hostile action during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His death occurred while Kennedy deliberated whether to authorize the airstrike that would trigger invasion and potential nuclear war. The Joint Chiefs didn't know how close Kennedy came to authorizing that strike. Anderson's death nearly pushed Kennedy over the threshold. Kennedy told advisors they would need to strike the air defense site. Once American bombs fell, the entire apparatus of escalation would begin. Once aircraft crossed Cuban airspace, Khrushchev's options would narrow catastrophically. Instead, Kennedy made a different choice. He authorized a secret communication to Khrushchev through Soviet intelligence officer Georgy Bolshakov. The message: if the Soviets withdraw missiles from Cuba, Americans will withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey. What Kennedy didn't tell Khrushchev: the Jupiter missiles were obsolete and already scheduled for retirement. What Kennedy did tell Khrushchev: Americans would publicly deny any such arrangement. To the world, Soviet withdrawal would appear as American triumph. Khrushchev would receive no public credit for the Turkish concession. This was the offer: preserve the appearance of American victory, allow the premier to retreat without public humiliation, get the missiles out. What Khrushchev didn't know: Kennedy's domestic position was precarious. Families were building bomb shelters. Children practiced evacuation drills. Grocery stores were stripped bare as panicked civilians stockpiled supplies. Khrushchev believed American political pressure would force Kennedy to negotiate at any cost. He believed Kennedy's vulnerability was his greatest weakness. What Khrushchev didn't understand: Kennedy's vulnerability was his greatest strength. Kennedy could point to public fear and explain that Americans expected decisive action. He could frame any military response as forced upon him by public opinion. By Friday, October 26th, Khrushchev received Kennedy's message. He decided. He would order missile withdrawal. He would announce this publicly, framing it as Soviet concession to prevent unwanted war. What Khrushchev didn't know: American intelligence officer Oleg Penkovsky had already provided the CIA with detailed information about every Soviet missile site in Cuba, intelligence that would have made American airstrikes devastatingly effective. Penkovsky had also provided information about Soviet military capabilities and limitations, shaping American calculations throughout the crisis. Penkovsky had been recruited months earlier, paid substantial sums, convinced by handlers that American military advantages were overwhelming, that cooperation served his interests. His decision to betray his country would soon result in his execution. But by then, his intelligence had already altered history. On Saturday, October 27th, Khrushchev announced Soviet withdrawal in a radio broadcast. Soviet vessels received orders to cease movement toward Cuba. Cargo ships carrying missiles and equipment were ordered back to Soviet ports. The American quarantine remained. Naval forces continued tracking Soviet vessels. Aircraft continued reconnaissance, but the acute phase had ended. The missiles were being removed. Immediate threat was receding. What the American public didn't know, the crisis had been far more dangerous than Kennedy acknowledged. What Soviet citizens didn't know, their premier had been humiliated, forced to accept what appeared as complete defeat. What neither side fully understood, how close they had come to catastrophe that would have killed hundreds of millions across multiple continents. The crisis had been decided not by military force, but by individuals operating at the margins of authority, by submarine commanders choosing not to launch, by intelligence officers choosing betrayal, by advisors urging restraint. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. From Monday, October 22nd, when Kennedy announced the quarantine, through Saturday, October 27th, when Khrushchev announced withdrawal. 13 days when the world held its breath. The full implications took years to become clear. Khrushchev's miscalculation was rooted in his belief that Kennedy wouldn't risk war. Kennedy's calculation, the risk of war, was acceptable compared to allowing Soviet missiles 90 miles from American soil. Khrushchev believed public opinion would force Kennedy to negotiate from weakness. Kennedy calculated public opinion would force him to act from strength. Both were correct about aspects of their analysis. Both were catastrophically wrong about others. In the months following, American investigators interrogated Soviet personnel who had been stationed in Cuba. They learned about the tactical nuclear weapons. They learned about standing orders permitting field commanders to employ those weapons during invasion. They learned the world had been separated from thermonuclear war by the judgment of a handful of military commanders operating with incomplete information. Vasily Arkhipov survived. He rose to admiral, served until 1998, dying at 73, never knowing his decision not to authorize a nuclear torpedo had possibly saved hundreds of millions of lives. Oleg Penkovsky's treachery was discovered in late 1962. He was interrogated, tried, and executed by firing squad on May 16, 1963. His body was cremated. The KGB never revealed details of his final days. His sacrifice for American intelligence remained classified for decades. Most of the world never knew who he was or what he'd done. Rudolf Anderson was buried with full military honors, his remains repatriated. His death underscored the extraordinary risks military personnel faced even in a crisis that never erupted into war. Khrushchev's political position was permanently damaged. He remained in power 2 more years before being removed in 1964 by rivals who felt his handling of Cuba had undermined Soviet prestige. The military demanded increased funding and modernization. The Soviet Union embarked on massive strategic expansion. The Navy, vastly inferior in 1962, was expanded dramatically. By the 1970s, it was genuinely formidable, capable of projecting power globally. The American military received authorization for continued expansion. Kennedy approved deployment of 1,000 Minuteman ICBMs over 4 years. The American arsenal expanded to approximately 30,000 warheads by the late 1960s. The crisis that nearly destroyed civilization became the catalyst for an accelerated arms race of terrifying proportions. Kennedy, politically strengthened, was assassinated in 1963 before capitalizing on his triumph. Khrushchev was removed in 1964, a consequence of perceived failure. The world moved forward. The crisis faded into history, remembered as the moment the Cold War came closest to becoming hot war. But the fundamental nature of superpower competition had transformed. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed truths that would reverberate through the remainder of the 20th century. First, Both superpowers possessed strategic forces far exceeding what deterrence required, multiple times over, enough to kill every human being and render Earth uninhabitable for generations. Second, the outcome of direct military confrontation couldn't be predicted or controlled. People making decisions at the highest levels lacked complete information. People implementing those decisions at lower levels had different information, priorities, and judgments. Vasily Arkhipov didn't possess the same information as Nikita Khrushchev. Their decisions operated independently. This realization birthed mutually assured destruction, MAD. If both sides could destroy each other regardless of who struck first, neither could rationally initiate thermonuclear exchange. Both would be destroyed. The logic was impeccable. Any first strike would meet overwhelming retaliation, ensuring mutual annihilation. This logic led to the hotline, direct communication between American and Soviet leadership. It led to strategic arms limitation talks producing proliferation agreements. It shaped the entire architecture of Cold War deterrence until the Soviet collapse in 1991. The crisis also revealed profound limits of nuclear deterrence. Both superpowers could destroy each other's societies. Yet this capability hadn't prevented Khrushchev from placing missiles in Cuba. The threat of nuclear retaliation hadn't dissuaded him. American military superiority hadn't translated into diplomatic leverage sufficient to prevent Soviet action. Instead, crisis resolution came through negotiation, compromise, and judicious use of back channels by Robert Kennedy, George Bundy, and Soviet embassy representatives. Resolution came because both leaders, confronted with genuine possibility of thermonuclear war, decided victory's price was too high. But peace's price was substantial. Khrushchev accepted what appeared as complete, humiliating defeat. American missiles remained in Turkey, kept secret from the public. Americans believed Kennedy achieved absolute triumph. They didn't know about the Turkish concession. They didn't know about back-channel negotiations. This divide between public narrative and historical facts would characterize Cold War diplomacy for decades. Leaders would achieve agreements serving genuine mutual interests while presenting them domestically as triumphs, as victories, as evidence of their system's righteousness. The crisis had profound consequences for individuals involved, consequences many would contemplate for the rest of their lives. Kennedy died less than a year later, struck down in Dallas. He wouldn't see long-term consequences of his decisions. He wouldn't know his calculated risk prevented a third world war that could have killed hundreds of millions. Khrushchev spent remaining years in political exile after removal, living in a dacha outside Moscow, his security detail actually isolating him from political activity. He died in 1971, his role largely forgotten by the Soviet system he'd served. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains, more than 6 decades later, the closest the world has come to thermonuclear war. No shots fired in anger except the missile that killed Rudolf Anderson. No armies invaded. No battles fought. Yet consequences extended across decades. Political calculations in Moscow and Washington rippled through history, shaping the arms race, shaping diplomacy, shaping the ultimate trajectory of the 20th century. What Nikita Khrushchev didn't know when he approved Operation Anadr in September 1962, his gamble would fail. The Americans would detect deployment almost immediately. Kennedy would choose to accept war's risk rather than accept Soviet strategic deployment. The world would be brought to the brink, and the outcome would be perceived as complete Soviet defeat. What the entire world didn't know, how close it came to ending. The men who made crucial decisions during those 13 days operated with incomplete information, facing incomprehensible pressures, forced to choose without knowing if choices led to peace or catastrophe. Khrushchev gambled Kennedy wouldn't risk war. He lost. Kennedy gambled American military possessed sufficient superiority to handle Soviet-armed Cuban forces in ground invasion. That calculation was never tested, but evidence suggests it would have been catastrophically wrong. Vasily Arkhipov decided not to fire a nuclear-armed torpedo at American vessels. His decision was made quietly, without public acknowledgement, without historical commemoration. For decades, his role in preventing thermonuclear war was entirely unknown. He was a man who altered history by choosing not to act, by restraining a superior from launching a weapon that would have changed everything. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as warning and vindication, a warning that the margin between peace and annihilation is far narrower than we hope, a vindication that even in existential crisis, human judgment, moral courage, and willingness to negotiate can prevail against escalation's logic. The crisis revealed a truth both Kennedy and Khrushchev came to appreciate. Their decisions affected not just their nations, but the entire human species. The power they wielded could end civilization. This power imposed upon them a moral obligation to use it with extraordinary care. In the aftermath, both leaders took steps to reduce tensions. They established the hotline. They negotiated the limited test ban treaty 8 months after crisis resolution, restricting nuclear weapons testing. This represented genuine attempts to arrest nuclear escalation. These steps didn't end the Cold War. They didn't prevent accumulation of vast arsenals. They didn't prevent future crises. But they represented recognition, shared by both men, that some risks weren't worth taking, that some victories weren't worth winning if victory meant civilization's destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis teaches us that war and peace calculus is far more complex than military analysis suggests. It teaches us that people making decisions at the highest levels often operate with incomplete information. It teaches us that individuals at lower authority levels can shape history profoundly. It teaches us that the margin between peace and catastrophe is terrifyingly narrow. But most importantly, it teaches us that even facing existential crisis, even when stakes are civilization's survival, negotiation, compromise, and willingness to step back remain possible, that human capacity for restraint can triumph over escalation's logic. That even men leading nuclear superpowers can choose to preserve civilization when confronted with what nuclear war truly means. Vasily Arkhipov made that choice in a submarine beneath Atlantic waters. Nikita Khrushchev made that choice in the Kremlin, ordering missile withdrawal and accepting perceived defeat. John F. Kennedy made that choice in the White House, accepting back-channel settlement rather than authorizing airstrikes that might have killed millions. These men altered history by deciding peace was worth the price. They saved the world not through military force or political triumph, but through judgment, restraint, and willingness to compromise when the stakes were existence itself. That is the true legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not that Americans or Soviets proved superior, not that one system triumphed, but that even enemies locked in mortal ideological struggle can find wisdom to step back from the abyss. That even facing existential threat, human judgment and moral courage remain possible. The missiles were withdrawn. The crisis passed. The world moved forward into a future that might have been obliterated on any one of those 13 days in October 1962. We are still here because men chose restraint. We are still here because they saw what was at stake. We are still here because they made different choices than their miscalculations predicted.